Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Bumarito's discussion on practice, meditation, and mindfulness. So let us begin. So practice. So the way Bumarito paints a picture is a very attractive way. Buddhism is a response to a fundamental fact of the human condition, and that is the first noble truth. Life is suffering. Suffering is a mismatch between one's expectations and the way the world is. So the goal of Buddhism, what Buddhism is a two-step process of philosophy, which is identifying the way the world is, especially the recognition of karma, of enlightenment, of the no-self truth, and so on. And then the second step is the step of practice, developing techniques to be able to see the world that way. That is, once we cognitively understand, we understand with the intellect the way the world is. Again, especially enlightenment, karma, and no-self doctrine. Once we see intellectually that that is the case, that's not the end of the story. Now the kind of the real journey of the Buddhist begins. Now it is the task of engaging in different kinds of techniques so that we can come to see or experience the world that way. And that is practice. Practice is the set of techniques that enables one to see the world or to change our outlook. That's how Marito puts it. To change our outlook in such a way that we see what's truly there. And it enables us to see clearly, as he puts it. So that's the idea of practice. The goal is enlightenment, right? If you do the practice correctly, you will transition between just cognitively and the intellect understanding the basic, doctrines of the universe, again, especially the no-self doctrine, to being enlightened, which is to actually see the way to see the world in accordance with the way it is, namely in the enlightened fashion. So how do we attain enlightenment? Well, there's a set of practices, but Buddhism is this huge religion. It's a global religion. It's been around for many hundreds of years, and it's across multiple different countries. So it's a very vast tradition, and it has very different kind of manifestations. It has people that commit to it in different ways or understand it in different ways. For example, here we have a picture of monks. So there are people that are so committed to Buddhism that their whole life revolves around Buddhism practices. Not only that they do that, every day, but that the whole life structure, like in the monastery, is to engaging in the practices to attain enlightenment. That is what they do, right? They're so committed. Like in Christianity, we can think of like Christian monks that separate themselves from society and dedicate themselves to prayer and to be attaining kind of a union with God, which is the goal of the Christian monk. Something like that happens in Buddhist, or at least some Buddhist practices. There are people that are that committed. But much like in Christianity, practices vary widely. Some people that call themselves Christians do so because they go to church on Sundays, they have some rudimentary kind of knowledge of, say, the Bible or some Christian teachings, and they at least verbally say, yeah, that's the case, but it influences their actual behavior in the world to a much more limited extent. We see very similar kinds of things happen in the Buddhist tradition. There's this very widespread of practices of those that self-identify as Buddhist, and then they're committed to different extents. And there's a major division, and this is the one that Bomarito emphasizes, and he uses the loose categories of modern Buddhism versus traditional Buddhism to make that distinction. And the traditional Buddhist looks much more like a religion when scholars think of religion. So it involves things like rituals, like actual ceremonies, like burning of incense, like veneration of the dead and things like that. So much more like traditional Christian practices. In those traditional Buddhist practices, they have those like very ritualized ceremonies. And also typically they create communities, right? They're communities that kind of understand themselves as participants in this kind of collective action that is the Buddhist practices. So they're not merely more formalized ceremonials that are created for the sake of like Buddhist practices, but a lot of people see themselves as in communion with those practices, and crucially see those practices as a way of interacting with things like supernatural beings. So that a huge element of the traditional Buddhist way of thinking includes this supernatural beings, not quite gods, but godlike entities that are not like in spatial space and time, and their ability to interact with these beings is kind of made formalized by those rituals, much like we see in like Catholicism, for example. There are these ceremonies that are ritualized, and the point of those is to interact with, say, like saints. There's some structural similarities that we see in a lot of Buddhist traditions. So that's one of the main strands in Buddhist practice. The other one, the one that Bomarito himself is a participant, and the one that a lot of Westerners feel attracted to, he just labels modern Buddhism. And this one is not as kind of committed to the more ritualistic ceremonies, like taking very seriously the stories of supernatural beings and things like that. But it's more concerned with psychological elements. It's engaging in a lot of different practices, Buddhist practices of like meditation, mindfulness, and things like that. And the goal of these Buddhist practitioners is a much more kind of humane goal of psychological stability and contentment and tranquility. Very valuable goals, of course, but they don't have the like supernatural communion with beings that are outside of space and time, which is more like the traditional religion element. Modern Buddhists either don't believe in those things or at least shy away from participation in those practices. That's a fundamental divide within the tradition of Buddhism. Um, and again, Bomarito himself is a participant of the modern Buddhism strand. So what are some of these practices, especially the ones that are more kind of amenable to the Western mind, or the one that the modern Buddhist will take seriously? And one of them is meditation. Meditation is a particular kind of practice that helps the Buddhists kind of distance themselves from society in a particular way, that enables them to focus on a lot of truths about reality, like the Four Noble Truths, in such a way that enables them to internalize those truths and see the way the world is, and in accordance with those truths. So, in other words, attain alignment. And meditation typically involves, or perhaps necessarily involves, something like solitude, the separation from this particular social context. So solitude can be an aid for meditation. And one of the main Buddhist reasons for thinking so is that if you're in a social context, if you're in a club, if you're with your family, if you're going to a movie theater, if you're doing some social event, the social event itself requires your attention. In fact, your attention is consumed by the participation in that social event. So the thought of meditating about, the fundamental nature of reality, the Four Noble Truths, and the self-doctrine, like that's just not in the picture, right? You don't have the time to do that simply because your attention is occupied elsewhere. You're doing the social events. So there's the very practical solitude or social isolation as a condition for meditation, just because now that will create space for one to like actually meditate instead of being consumed with other things. So that's the practical element. But there's also a kind of deeper psychological observation that Buddhists emphasize, and that is that there is this need for regular separation from society for the sake of meditating well. In one of the ways in which Pumarito points that out is that many times we're not aware. We're so used to being in the social context that we're not aware how much it's actually influencing and coloring the way we experience the world. And one of the cool examples he uses is that he talks about if you're from, let's say, a small town and you grew up in this small town, and you used to speak in a particular way. You have this particular kind of accent. You have these like things you say, or things you complain about, or things you brag about, or like there's this like set of things you do, a set of concerns that are salient in that group, and like ways of speaking about a particular vocabulary and like an accent, things like that. That's how societies kind of like bond and manifest themselves. So if you grow up in that kind of environment and then move away, and then your interests start changing, you start caring about something else, for a while, you might not even remember, you might not realize it's not part of how you think of yourself to like care about those issues, to speak that way, and so on. But then if you go back and visit, if you're not aware of the way what you're doing, many times people in that context and that small group bring within social expectations, and namely expectations that you, to a large extent, you're still the same person. You still have the same concerns, so they speak to you that way, right? They use the same kind of accent, the same kind of idiom, idiomatic expressions, and speak about the same kinds of concerns or things they complain about, and so on. So they expect that you still think the same way. And what tends to happen is that you don't think about it too much. You just kind of find yourself complying with the expectations. You find yourself saying the same things, complaining about the same things, bragging about the same things, falling into the same vocabulary and accent, right? So unknowingly, unconsciously, you just find yourself accepting the expectations, the social expectations imposed upon you. And you might not even notice. And then if you do notice, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I didn't consciously decide to do that. That's just what I naturally do in the social context. Ippomarito points out that that's pervasive. I mean, that's just one of the more clear examples, but that's how we function in the world. We use language, which is kind of distortive, but we use language to navigate, to create social context, to engage in relationships with others, to get things done. And the very kind of nature of social interaction is precisely to use language in this particular way. And you just find yourself reinforcing the stereotypes of, say, like the self, or say, like the use of language that is distortive and so on, if you're embedded in those social dynamics. So it is crucial to separate yourself, just to create some distance from that kind of habituation of seeing the world through those language dynamics, social dynamics, and so on. So separation is a condition for meditation in the deeper way, not just the practical way of your attention is not distracted by something else, but in the deeper way, that to the extent that you're a participant in those social dynamics, you might not even realize that you're being kind of habituated to look at the world through those particular kind of categories, social categories, and especially the idea that there's this deep self. Um, so solitude and meditation are a way for distancing yourself, to allow you to see the extent to which the linguistic narrative in which you frame and understand your life are coloring what's actually in front of you, right? So that distance is a condition for you to actually experience the way the world is. So Bomarito also brings a warning. He says, but hey, careful, there are Buddhists who do like take years long like retreats of solitude precisely for the sake of separation from like the traps of social expectations. But careful, I'm not suggesting, says Bomarito, that you do that now. Like, solitude is risky. We are social beings. We crave the acceptance of others. That's why we fall so quickly into the social roles that people project onto us. So the recommendation is not just cut away your, connections to others. That's bad. Like, that's fine, be with others, but be aware of the extent to which the way you talk to others distorts the way the world is, right? So takes the recommendation for solitude as a cautious, gradual kind of recommendation. And he points out, for example, that one of the most serious punishments that we impose on people are things like solitary confinement. Solitary confinement can be disastrous, can be extremely painful, precisely because humans crave human interaction. So be aware of that, right? So the recommendation for solitude is a gradual, for the sake of better understanding yourself, not to like cut ties with humanity, full stop. So a different way of putting that is that when you're meditating in solitude, the very act of meditation must itself be properly framed and understood as an activity of getting you to see clearly past the images constructed by language in the normal kind of social context. And you must understand your experience of solitude in that way, so that you can meditate about the fundamental noble truths, no self-doctrine, and so on, and do so successfully, instead of just feeling lonely and despair by yourself. So solitude is a condition for meditation. What are the basics? So what is meditation? What is this thing you're doing when you're in solitude and you're trying to like see the world clearly? And here's the extremely basic description that Bomarito presents. Well, here are the steps to seeing the way the world is. Here's the steps to reorienting your perspective onto the way the world is. The first is listening. And he means not like listening to anything like rock music, right? He means listening to like great Buddhist teachers who know what they're doing, who understand, say, the no self doctrine, the distorted nature of language, and so on. So listen to when they describe the self as essentially composite, relational, empty, and in a state of constant flux. And like you listen to that, right? You use your intellect to grasp what that means. And the second part is, well, once you listen, you think about it. Okay, well, what this word means again, and you kind of engage your intellect to try to grasp that, idea of the self. But that's not enough. That's much too quick. Right? You can do that in a few minutes. The next step to reorienting your outlook is to meditate upon the ideas. That is to spend a decent amount of time thinking about the no self doctrine in such a way that you internalize what it means, and you end up seeing the world through that angle. So here is the closest thing to a definition. That's not quite a very sharp definition, but the closest thing to a definition that Bomarito gives us about the nature of meditation. So the third step in this three-step process to seeing the world clearly, to changing your outlook, is to carefully consider something important, like what the four noble truths, no self-doctrine, some such fundamental Buddhist idea. But carefully consider it in such a way that it leads to internalization, like you savor it, you think about it, you kind of dwell within it, you ruminate over it, and you look at the world and try to see the world through those lenses, right? That is the act of meditation, the act of like letting yourself kind of sit around with the idea in hand, like there's no self-doctrine, and allowing it to change your outlook, and noticing when your outlook is distorting the world in a way that is contrary to that idea you're meditating on. So that's the rough idea, is just spending time with the idea, letting it sink, letting it, get within your own way of looking at the world. So internalizing the idea so that you see the world that way. And the thought is, this is not going to be simple. This is a lifelong commitment, or at least something close to a lifelong commitment. And the contrast is here with something like playing an instrument. If you go to some sort of a performance and you see someone playing the piano and they're super great, and you think, wow, that's great, I want to do that. It's foolish for you to say, oh, let me, on the weekend, I'll, get a book and play the piano and I'll practice, and, by next weekend, I'll perform for you guys. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. You need to spend a lot of time, like, understanding, listening to those that play the piano well, or understanding like the descriptions of practices and so on. And you spend a lot of time just practicing, right? The meditation is kind of like the practice to do the thing in question. If you're going to play the piano well, you practice and practice and practice. And at some point, it becomes second nature. Here's how he puts it. After a while, your hands make the sounds you want naturally without you thinking about it. There's a point in which the hands just move and you know what to do, and you're not thinking about the particular kind of motions of your fingers. And you want to reach that stage if you want to be a good piano player. And the same happens with changing your outlook. Meditation is in a Buddhist context, is like the latter phase, except that when you're getting used to it, experiencing the world is a radically different way. So meditation is like the practice, and the more you meditate on especially the fundamental Buddhist truths, the more you become, it becomes natural for you to see the world in that way. Like the piano player, the more you practice, the more you start seeing the world that way. The more you meditate, especially on those fundamental truths, the more you start seeing the way the world is. But it's a long project. It's a project that requires commitment, like playing the piano. And meditation is that way. So another very related practice to meditation is mindfulness. And meditation and mindfulness sometimes are used interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same. Mindfulness is something about being conscious. So here's again the closest thing to a definition of mindfulness. To be mindful means to deliberately fix your attention on certain things in a sustained way, like to focus your attention on something. And what is that something? Well, here's the ideal. Ideally, it is fixing your attention not in a way that is not mediated by thought or language, right? So it's not that you're thinking in the linguistic discursive sense of thinking that you have an inner monologue that is describing what is happening around you. That's not fixing your conscious mind at all. That's not mindfulness. Rather, something like the conscious experience of what is there. What is that according to the Buddhists? Well, it's a kind of the unity of the self with the totality of things. So when you're being mindful, you're experiencing the unity of yourself with the totality of things. And what it is to experience it as a unity is to recognize that you're in some deep way embedded in the totality of things. Your consciousness is a consciousness of what is there in this non-linguistically mediated, not thought-mediated, but rather just as it is. And that's ultimately enlightenment. If you're able to fully see the way that world, that way you're enlightened. In language and thought are no longer the mediation for the experience. The experience is just that experience of what is there, which is the unity of the self in the totality of things. And mindfulness is the attempt to do that, the attempt to be mindful of or conscious of what is before you at the moment without distractions. So it's a deliberate, conscious attempt to train your attention to focus on something without linguistic mediation. That's a better kind of definition of mindfulness. So the ability to fix and hold your attention on something is one crucial way of developing the control over your mental life. And the point is that if you start thinking about your mental life, you realize that it's not that you're in control, at least not a lot of the time, not most of the time, of what to think, but rather it feels like when you have this inner monologues going on, you're not just writing the story, but thoughts come to you. It seems like thoughts occur to you, not that you control them. And sometimes Buddhists call this like the crazy monkey of the mind. The mind is like a crazy monkey that jumps around with no direction. It goes on tangents, it goes back and it's directed. So it seems to be unruly, uncontrolled, moving about. And for the Buddhists, that's bad, partly because, well, it's not organized, but also because it distracts you from experiencing what's truly there. This inner kind of unstructured monologue of the monkey mind that is jumping around is preventing you from experiencing what is there, which is again the unity of the self or the totality of things. So it becomes an obstacle for maturity in the Buddhist sense, or the spiritual sense of maturity, and ultimately reaching alignment. To be mindful is to develop the capacity to control your ability to focus your attention on something, and thereby kind of control the crazy monkey, as it were, right? It's a way for you to take control of your thoughts, not for your thoughts to take control over you. And the Buddhists will point out this is very valuable because most of the time you suffer is because your mind keeps jumping around, back and forth, and you suffer not because you want to suffer, but because the crazy monkey's mind is kind of distracting you and focusing your attention in different ways, and the suffering comes out of that. If you had control over your mind, you will suffer a lot less, perhaps not at all. So here's what Bomarito points out. This goal of being mindful, being in control of your thoughts, not allowing to wander around us and distort things, is much easier said than done. Our minds love to wander away at a moment's notice, right? They just move about. And a very fundamental way, technique for developing mindfulness is the breathing technique. So the ability, like this monk here, is I take it doing the breathing technique. It's a kind of exercise that you just close your eyes. You can keep your eyes open, but the thought is to just breathe in and breathe out, and to not think at all, not no discursive inner monologue. Just concentrate your attention on the breathing in and the breathing out, not controlling the breathing, but rather having the mind be able to see the body work, especially the natural rhythm of breath, and not allowing the mind to wander in different directions to describe things in a linguistic discursive fashion, but rather just experiencing the unity of the breathing self. And that's an extremely basic exercise. So if you try, you're going to realize it's actually pretty hard to actually do well, and it takes a lot of practice. It's like when you play the piano, you see the piano player and they play so well, you think like, oh, I'm going to do it too, and then your fingers are very clumsy. You don't know how to move them, and it's very. So even the breathing exercise for the non-trained person is going to be very hard. But that's going to make you realize that, hey, controlling your mind is a lot harder than you thought. Being mindful of what is before you is very hard to do. And the breathing exercise is a kind of a starting level of exercise for you to start to do that. So listen here. I'll see you next time.